Her hands trembled as she faced the man before her, dust on her apron, fear in her voice. I can't pay you," she whispered, her eyes filling with shame. The stranger said nothing, just smiled softly as if he already knew something she didn't, because the man standing in her doorway wasn't there to collect her debt. He owned the very bank she owed, and what he wanted from her had nothing to do with money. The sky turned the color of old bruises before the first drops fell. She saw it coming from the porch, miles out, rolling across the valley like something alive, swallowing the hills in gray. The wind picked up first, pulling at her skirt, tugging strands of dark hair loose from the knot at her neck. She pressed her palm against the weathered post and watched the horizon disappear. The barn door rattled on its hinges. By the time she crossed the yard, the rain had started, fat, cold drops that hit the dust and vanished. Thunder cracked somewhere, beyond the ridge, deep enough to feel in her chest. She grabbed the rope and pulled the barn door shut, her hands already slick, the wood swollen and stubborn. Inside, the horse whinnied, nervous, stamping in the shadows. "Easy," she whispered, though her own heart was beating faster than it should. The roof groaned overhead. She looked up and saw the patch she'd nailed down last month, already pulling loose, the edges curling in the wind. Water dripped through, dark spots spreading across the dirt floor. She climbed the ladder with a hammer in her belt and nails between her teeth, the wood slick beneath her boots. The wind hit her the moment she reached the top, nearly knocking her sideways. She braced herself, one hand gripping the beam, the other reaching for the tin that flapped like a broken wing. Lightning split the sky. For half a second the world turned white, the valley, the fences, the road that led to town. Then darkness again, and thunder so loud it shook the ladder beneath her. She drove the nail in hard, once, twice, her hands shaking more from cold than fear. The rain came down in sheets now, soaking through her dress, plastering her hair to her face. Another piece of tin tore loose on the far side. She crawled across the beam, her breath coming fast, her fingers numb. Below, the horse screamed. She froze, listening. Through the rain, she heard it, hoofbeats, fast, coming up the road. Her first thought was the bank. They'd sent someone. Again. She slid down the ladder, her boots hitting mud, and ran to the fence. Through the curtain of rain, she saw him, a figure on horseback, bent low, coat black with water. The horse stumbled, righted itself, stumbled again. The rider pulled hard on the reins, but the animal's legs buckled. The man hit the ground before she could move. For a moment she stood there, rain hammering her shoulders, watching him lie still in the mud. The horse staggered a few steps and stopped, head hanging, flanks heaving. She should have stayed inside, should have let the storm decide. But her feet carried her forward anyway. He was face down when she reached him, one arm twisted beneath his chest, his hat a few feet away in a puddle. She knelt beside him, hands hovering, unsure. His coat was thick, expensive, too fine for a drifter. Mud caked his boots. Rain streamed off his dark hair. "Mister," she said, her voice barely cutting through the storm. "Nothing." She pressed 2 fingers to his neck just below the jaw and felt the pulse. Steady, strong. Relief hit her harder than she expected. She hooked her hands under his arms and pulled, dragging him inch by inch toward the barn. He was heavier than he looked, dead weight and drenched. Her boots slipped in the mud, her arms burned. The barn door yawned open, spilling yellow lamplight into the rain. She hauled him inside, every muscle screaming, and let him down as gently as she could onto a bed of dry straw. His chest rose and fell. Blood streaked his temple, mixing with rain. She pressed a rag to the wound, her hands shaking now for reasons she didn't want to name. The horse outside whinnied again, and she remembered, his animal, still standing in the storm. She ran back out, grabbed the reins, and led the exhausted creature into the barn beside her own. Its coat steamed in the cool air. When she turned back, the man's eyes were open. He stared at the ceiling for a long moment, blinking slowly, like he was trying to remember how he'd gotten there. Then his gaze shifted to her, dark eyes, sharp even through the haze of pain. "You're awake," she said, keeping her voice steady. He tried to sit up, winced, stayed down. "Easy," she murmured, the same word she'd used on the horse. "You took a fall." His hand went to his head, fingers finding the cut. He looked at the blood on his palm, then at her. "Your barn?" She nodded. "I'm sorry." His voice was low, rough around the edges. "I didn't mean to." You didn't have much choice. He looked around, taking in the patched walls, the tools hanging crooked on nails, the single lantern casting long shadows. His gaze lingered on her, on the soaked dress clinging to her frame, the exhaustion written in every line of her face. You pulled me in, he said. Not a question. You were in the mud. You didn't have to. She shrugged, wringing water from her sleeves. Couldn't leave you out there. He studied her for a long moment, something unreadable passing behind his eyes. Then he shifted, testing his weight, and started to push himself up. She stepped forward, hand raised. You should rest. I've rested. He got to his feet, swaying slightly, one hand braced against the barn wall. His coat dripped onto the straw. I'll be gone by morning. In this? She gestured toward the door, where rain hammered the earth like fists. You won't make it a mile. He didn't argue, just stood there, dripping, looking like a man who'd been running too long to remember why. She crossed to the corner and pulled an old quilt from a crate, shook it out, and handed it to him. You can stay till the storm passes. He took it slowly, as if expecting her to change her mind. I can pay. Her jaw tightened. I don't take money from strangers. Then what do you take? She met his eyes, and for a second the weight between them felt heavier than the storm. Nothing, she said quietly. Just don't make me regret it. He nodded once, wrapping the quilt around his shoulders. He looked smaller somehow, less dangerous, just tired. Human. She turned back to the ladder, climbed halfway, and hammered the last piece of tin into place. The roof held. The rain softened to a steady drumming. When she came down, he was sitting on an overturned crate, staring at his hands. You live alone? He asked. Yes. Long enough. He didn't press. She was grateful for that. The lantern flickered. Outside, thunder rolled away toward the east, softer now, like the sky was finally letting go. The barn settled into an uneasy quiet, broken only by the horses shifting in their stalls and the rain tapping the roof. She sat down across from him, her back against the wall, knees pulled up. Her dress was still damp, clinging cold to her skin, but she didn't move to change, didn't want to leave him alone in her barn, even if he seemed harmless, especially because he seemed harmless. What's your name? He asked after a while. She hesitated. Names had weight. Sarah. He nodded slowly. Thomas. A lie, probably. She didn't call him on it. Where were you headed? She asked. Nowhere in particular. Dangerous way to travel. Sometimes nowhere's safer than somewhere. She almost smiled at that. Almost. The silence stretched again, but it wasn't uncomfortable. Just two people waiting for the storm to decide when they could stop pretending they weren't afraid. He looked at her then. Really looked. The kind of look that saw past the mud and the exhaustion and the walls she kept up. You didn't have to help me. You said that already. I mean it. So do I. His mouth twitched, almost a smile. You always this stubborn? Only when strangers collapse in my yard. This time, he did smile, just a little, and for a moment he looked younger, less haunted. The cut on his temple had stopped bleeding. She should have cleaned it properly, but she was too tired to care. Outside, the rain began to slow. The wind died down. The world felt softer, like it had been scrubbed clean. She closed her eyes, just for a second, and when she opened them again, dawn was bleeding through the cracks in the barn walls. Gray light, pale and thin. The storm had passed. Thomas was still there, sitting in the same spot, the quilt draped over his shoulders. He hadn't moved, hadn't tried to leave. He was watching her, and when their eyes met, something shifted, something small and fragile and dangerous. Thank you, he said quietly. She didn't know what to say to that, so she stood, brushed straw from her skirt, and walked to the door. Pulled it open. The valley stretched out before her, soaked and shining, the fences sagging under the weight of rain. Her land, what was left of it. Behind her, she heard him rise, heard his boots on the dirt floor. You should go, she said, not turning around. I should. But he didn't move, and neither did she. The sun crept over the ridge, slow and pale, and the world began to wake. Somewhere in the distance, a crow called. The horses stirred. The day began. But something had changed in the night, something neither of them could name yet. She stepped out into the mud, and he followed. Transition. As dawn broke over the soaked valley, the stranger's eyes lingered on her broken fences, and the quiet guilt he carried deepened into something harder to hide. The rain didn't stop. For 3 days it came down in waves, sometimes soft, sometimes violent, but always there, turning the world gray and the earth into something that swallowed your boots whole. Sarah watched it from the cabin window, arms crossed, listening to the steady drip from the corner of the porch where the roof had given up years ago. Behind her, Thomas sat at the table, a cup of coffee cooling between his hands. He hadn't left, hadn't tried. The first morning, he'd saddled his horse, checked the cinch twice, and stood in the barn doorway staring at the rain like it was a wall he couldn't climb. By noon, he'd unsaddled the animal and carried his gear into the corner, stacking it neatly against the wall. She hadn't asked him to stay, hadn't asked him to leave either. By the second day he'd started making himself useful. She'd found him in the barn at dawn, hammer in hand, driving nails into the frame where the wood had rotted through. He worked quietly, methodically, like a man who'd spent his life building things, or tearing them down. She couldn't tell which. "You don't have to do that," she'd said from the doorway. He hadn't looked up. "I know." "Then why?" "Because it needs doing." She'd left him to it. Came back an hour later with bread and eggs on a tin plate, set it down on the workbench without a word. When she returned that evening, the plate was clean, and the barn door hung straight for the first time in 2 years. Now, on the third day, the silence between them had settled into something almost comfortable. Almost. She poured herself coffee from the pot on the stove, the steam curling up into the dim light. Outside, the rain hammered the roof, relentless. Inside, the fire crackled low, barely enough to keep the chill out. "How long have you been here?" Thomas asked, his voice cutting through the quiet. She glanced at him over her shoulder. "The farm? Yes. All my life." She turned back to the window. "My father built the cabin, raised me here, died here. I'm sorry. Don't be. He had a good life, worked hard, loved the land." Her voice tightened. "He just didn't love it enough to keep it." Thomas was quiet for a moment. Then carefully, "You mean the debt?" Her jaw clenched. She didn't answer. He set the cup down, the ceramic scraping softly against the wood. "How much do you owe?" "Enough." She crossed to the stove, stirred the pot even though it didn't need stirring. "More than I can pay." "When's it due? Does it matter?" "It might." She turned to face him then, and the look in her eyes was sharp enough to cut. "Why do you care?" He held her gaze, steady, unflinching. "Because I'm sitting in your house, eating your food, and you won't let me pay for any of it. So maybe I care because you won't let me do anything else." The fire popped. Rain drummed the roof. She looked away first. 2 months. I have 2 months to come up with what I owe, or the bank takes it. All of it? All of it. He leaned back in the chair, exhaling slowly. His hand went to his coat pocket, fingers brushing something inside, then stopped. He pulled his hand back and folded his arms instead. "There's always a way," he said quietly. "Not for people like me." "What does that mean?" "It means the bank doesn't care if you've got nowhere else to go. It means they take what's theirs and you take what's left." She laughed, bitter and low, which is usually nothing. Thomas said nothing, just sat there, staring at the table, his jaw tight. She watched him for a long moment, trying to read the shadows that moved across his face. He looked like a man carrying something heavy, something he couldn't put down. "You ever owe somebody?" she asked. His eyes flicked up to hers. "Yes." "What'd you do?" "Paid it. And if you couldn't?" He hesitated. "I'd find another way. That's easy to say when you're not the one drowning." He didn't argue, just looked at her like he understood more than he should. The rain softened. The afternoon stretched long and gray. She hung wet clothes on a line strung across the cabin, his coat, her shawl, socks, and shirts dripping onto the floor. The air smelled like damp wool and wood smoke. Thomas stood and crossed to the window, hands in his pockets, watching the valley disappear into mist. "You ever think about leaving? Every day?" "Why don't you?" "Because this is all I have." She pulled a chair closer to the fire and sat, rubbing her hands together. "And because leaving feels like letting them win. Them, the bank, the town, everyone who said I couldn't do it alone." She stared into the flames. "My father fought to keep this place. I'm not going to be the one who loses it." Thomas turned, leaning against the window frame. "Sometimes losing isn't the same as failing. Tell that to the man who takes your land." He looked at her for a long time, something unreadable in his eyes. Then he pushed off the frame and walked to the door. "I'm going to check the fences. In this, better now than after they're down." She stood, reaching for her coat. I'll come with you. You don't have to. Neither do you. He almost smiled at that. Almost. They stepped out into the rain together, boots sinking into mud, the cold hitting them like a fist. The valley stretched out before them, gray and endless, the fences sagging under the weight of water. They walked the line in silence, Sarah pointing out the weak posts, Thomas driving stakes into the ground with a hammer he'd found in the barn. His hands were steady, precise. She watched him work, noticing the way he moved. Like someone who'd done this before, but not recently. Like someone who'd forgotten what it felt like to build instead of break. "You're good at this," she said after a while. He shrugged, wiping rain from his face. "I've done it before." "Where?" "Lots of places. That's not an answer." He looked at her, rain dripping from his hair, and for a second she thought he might tell her, thought he might let her in. But then he turned back to the fence and drove another nail home. "No," he said quietly. "I guess it's not." They worked until the light began to fail, until their hands were numb and their clothes soaked through. By the time they made it back to the cabin, the fire had burned down to embers. Thomas rebuilt it while she peeled off her wet coat and hung it by the door. She made soup from what little she had. Potatoes, onions, a bone she'd been saving. It wasn't much, but it was warm, and they ate in silence. The only sound the scrape of spoons against tin bowls. When they finished, she cleared the table, and he washed the dishes in a basin by the stove. It felt strange, having someone else in her space. Strange, but not unwelcome. That night she gave him a blanket and pointed to the corner by the fire. "You can sleep there." "Where will you sleep?" "The loft." She nodded toward the ladder. "I always do." He looked like he wanted to argue, but didn't. Just took the blanket and spread it out on the floor. She climbed the ladder, her body aching, her mind restless. From the loft she could see him below, a dark shape curled by the fire. She thought he'd fallen asleep, but then she saw him reach into his coat and pull something out, a small leather book worn at the edges. He opened it, and even from above she could see the pages were filled with rows of numbers, names, dates. He stared at them for a long time, his face hard in the firelight. Then he closed the book, tucked it back into his coat, and lay down. She watched him until his breathing slowed, until the fire burned low and the cabin settled into darkness. And she wondered, what kind of man carried a ledger like that? What kind of man came to a place like this with nothing but rain and guilt on his shoulders? She wondered if she'd ever find out. Outside, the storm pressed against the walls, relentless. But inside, for the first time in months, the cabin didn't feel quite so empty. Transition. When the rain finally ceased, the world seemed cleaner, but the lies between them glistened like dew waiting for sunlight to expose them. The sun returned like a stranger no one expected. Sarah woke to light streaming through the loft window, pale gold and clean, the kind of light that made everything look new. She sat up, blinking, listening. No rain, no wind, just the soft murmur of birds outside and the creak of the cabin settling into morning. Below, the fire had burned out. Thomas was gone. For a moment her chest tightened, the irrational fear that he'd left in the night, taken what little she had and disappeared. But then she heard it, the rhythmic thunk of an axe splitting wood. She climbed down the ladder, pulled on her boots, and stepped outside. He was in the yard, sleeves rolled to his elbows, sweat already darkening his shirt despite the cool air. A pile of split logs grew beside him, neat and even. He swung the axe again, and the wood cracked clean down the middle. She leaned against the porch post, arms crossed, watching. He didn't notice her at first. Kept working, his movements steady, efficient. There was something almost meditative about it. The way he set each log, measured the swing, followed through, like he was trying to work something out with every strike. When he finally looked up, he paused, axe resting on his shoulder. "Morning, morning." She nodded toward the wood. "You didn't have to do that. Needed doing. You say that a lot." He almost smiled. "You say you didn't have to a lot." She shook her head, but there was no heat in it. "Coffee's ready if you want it. I'll finish this first." She left him to it, went back inside and poured 2 cups. When she came back out, he was stacking the wood against the side of the cabin, building a neat cord that would last through winter, if she was still here by winter. She handed him the coffee. He took it, nodded his thanks, and drank it standing, looking out at the valley. The land had changed. The rain had washed it clean, left it gleaming under the sun. The hills rolled green and soft in the distance, and the creek, dry for months, now ran silver through the low ground. It was beautiful. It was always beautiful. That was the cruelest part. You ever think about what you'd do if you didn't have to fight for it? Thomas asked, his voice quiet. She looked at him. The land? Yeah. No. She sipped her coffee, felt the warmth spread through her chest. Because I've always had to fight for it. I don't know what else there is. He nodded slowly, like he understood that better than she expected. My father used to say the land owns you more than you own it. He was right. He usually was. Thomas set his cup down on the porch rail. Didn't make him easier to live with. She caught something in his tone, something old and buried. He gone? Yes. I'm sorry. Don't be. He wasn't a good man. He looked at her then, and there was no self-pity in his eyes, just fact. But he taught me how to work. I'll give him that. She didn't know what to say to that, so she said nothing. They spent the morning working side by side. He fixed the porch steps she'd been meaning to get to for months, replaced boards that had rotted through, tightened hinges on the barn door. She tended the garden, pulling weeds, checking the plants that had survived the storm. The soil was soft, easy to work, and she lost herself in the rhythm of it. Dig, pull, smooth. By midday, the sun was high and warm, the kind of heat that felt good after days of cold rain. She straightened, wiping her hands on her skirt, and saw him walking toward her with a bucket. Thought you might need water, he said, setting it down beside the garden. Thank you. He crouched down, looking at the rows she'd planted. What are you growing? Potatoes, carrots, beans. She knelt beside him, pointing. That's squash. And over there, tomatoes. If they make it, they'll make it. You sound sure. You know what you're doing. I can tell. She glanced at him, surprised. How? The way you handle the soil, like you're listening to it. She laughed, short and unexpected. That's the strangest compliment I've ever gotten. Doesn't make it less true. She looked at him for a long moment, at the way the sun caught his face, made him look less guarded, less like a man running from something. You ever work a farm? Once. Time ago. He stood, brushing dirt from his hands. Hated it then. Thought I'd never do it again. And now? He looked around, at the garden, the cabin, the valley stretching out in all directions. Now I think I didn't know what I had. There was a weight to those words. She didn't press. That afternoon she taught him how to read the soil, how to tell if it needed water or air, how to check the roots without damaging them. He listened carefully, asked questions that showed he was actually paying attention. It felt strange, teaching someone. She'd been alone so long she'd forgotten what it was like to share the work. In return, he showed her how to mend the plow, a piece of equipment her father had left behind, rusted and broken. Thomas took it apart with patience she didn't expect, cleaned each piece, replaced what couldn't be saved, and put it back together. When he was done, it worked like new. Where'd you learn that? She asked, genuinely impressed. Trial and error, mostly error. He wiped grease from his hands with a rag. Spent a lot of time fixing things I broke. Sounds like a hard way to learn. It was. They fell into a rhythm over the next few days. Her tending the land, him repairing what years of struggle had worn down. The cabin began to feel less like it was falling apart and more like it was holding on. The barn door closed properly. The fence held. The roof didn't leak. And somewhere in the middle of all that work, something else began to grow. It started small, a shared glance when something went right. A joke about the rooster that woke them too early, the way he made coffee in the morning without her asking, or the way she set aside the best portion of dinner without thinking. One evening, as the sun dipped low and turned the valley gold, she found him by the fence line, just standing there, watching the light fade. She walked over, stood beside him. What are you thinking about? He didn't answer right away, just kept staring at the horizon. How easy it would be to stay. Her heart skipped. You planning to leave? That's not what I asked. He turned to her, and the look in his eyes was complicated, guilt and longing tangled together. No, I'm not planning to leave. She nodded, something warm unfurling in her chest. Good. They stood there in the fading light, close enough that she could feel the warmth of him, hear the steady rhythm of his breathing. The world felt still, quiet, like it was holding its breath. "Sarah," he said softly. "Yeah? Thank you for letting me stay." She looked up at him, at the way the last light caught his face, and for a moment she forgot about the debt, the bank, the fight she'd been losing for months. For a moment it was just the two of them, standing in the dusk, and that was enough. "You're welcome," she said. The days blurred together after that. Work and rest, sun and shadow, the easy companionship of two people who'd stopped asking questions they weren't ready to answer. He started going into town once a week for supplies, always returning before dark, always with something she needed but hadn't asked for. Nails, flour, a length of rope. She never asked where he got the money. He never offered an explanation. One afternoon, while he was gone, she went through the barn looking for tools and found his saddlebag tucked in the corner. She didn't mean to look inside, told herself she wouldn't, but her hands moved anyway, pulling the leather flap open. Inside, a clean shirt, a razor, a small leather-bound book. She pulled the book out, heart pounding, opened it. Pages and pages of names, amounts, dates, all written in careful, precise handwriting, and at the top of each page, stamped in faded ink, Dry Creek Savings and Loan. Her breath caught. She flipped through, her hands shaking, until she found it. Her name, her father's name, the loan, the amount owed, the date it was due, and beside it, in Thomas's handwriting, pending review. She stared at the words until they blurred. Footsteps crunched in the yard. She shoved the book back into the bag, her heart hammering, and stepped out of the barn just as Thomas rounded the corner, a sack of flour balanced on his shoulder. "Hey," he said, smiling. "Got you something?" She forced a smile back, her mind racing. "What is it?" "Sugar. Thought you might want to make something that isn't just potatoes." "Thank you." He set the sack down, looked at her more closely. "You all right?" "Fine." She wiped her hands on her skirt, avoiding his eyes. "Just tired." He nodded, but she could tell he didn't believe her. That night, she lay awake in the loft, staring at the ceiling, her mind spinning. The ledger, the names, the bank. He worked for the bank, or worse, he was the bank, and she'd let him into her home, let him fix her fences, let him become something she couldn't afford to lose. Below, she heard him shift by the fire, restless. She closed her eyes and tried to breathe through the panic rising in her chest. Tomorrow, she'd ask him. Tomorrow, she'd know the truth. But tonight, the lie between them felt almost like safety, and she wasn't ready to let it go. Transition, but every warm day carries a shadow, and the next rider from town brought it with him. The dust rose before the horse did. Sarah saw it from the garden, a thin line of brown cutting across the valley, moving steady and deliberate toward the farm. She straightened, shading her eyes with one hand, dirt still clinging to her fingers. The sun was high, the air warm, and for a moment she thought it might be Thomas returning from the creek where he'd gone to check the water level. But the rider was coming from town. Her stomach dropped. She wiped her hands on her apron and walked toward the house, her steps quickening. Thomas was on the porch, hammer in hand, mid-swing on a loose board. He looked up when he heard her boots on the steps. "Someone's coming," she said, her voice tight. He set the hammer down and stood, following her gaze. The rider was closer now, close enough to see the shape of the horse, the color of the coat. Dark, official. "Sheriff," Thomas said quietly. She nodded, her throat dry. They stood there together, waiting, as the horse and rider climbed the last stretch of road and came to a stop in the yard. Dust settled around them like fog. The man on the horse was older, gray at the temples, his hat pulled low against the sun. A silver star glinted on his chest. "Miss Carver," he said, tipping his hat. "Sheriff Dawson." Her voice was steady, but her hands were clenched at her sides. His eyes flicked to Thomas, lingering for a moment, then back to her. "Mind if I step down?" "Go ahead." He dismounted slowly, like a man who'd been in the saddle too long, and pulled a folded piece of paper from his coat pocket. He didn't hand it to her right away, just held it, looking uncomfortable. "I'm sorry to be the one to bring this," he said. She didn't reach for it. "What is it?" "Notice from the bank. Foreclosure proceedings." He held it out, and when she didn't take it, he set it on the porch rail. "You've got 30 days. The world tilted. She grabbed the post to steady herself, her knuckles white. 30 days, she repeated, her voice hollow. "That's what it says." He shifted his weight, glancing at Thomas again. "You missed the last payment. Bank's calling the loan. I told them I needed more time. I know. I'm sorry. They said the terms were clear. He looked genuinely pained. If you can come up with the full amount by the end of the month, they'll hold off. Otherwise, they take it. Yes, ma'am. She stared at the paper, at the official seal stamped in red wax, and felt something inside her crack. All the work. All the fighting. All the nights she'd stayed awake, planning, budgeting, praying, and it came down to a piece of paper in 30 days. Thomas stepped forward, his voice calm but firm. Who signed the order? The sheriff looked at him, eyes narrowing slightly. Bank manager. Why? Just asking. You got business with the bank? No, sir. The sheriff studied him for a long moment, then turned back to Sarah. You need help, Miss Carver. There are people in town who'd... I don't need charity. It's not charity. It's neighbors looking out for each other. It's the same thing. Her voice was sharper than she intended. She took a breath, forced herself to soften. Thank you, Sheriff. But I'll handle it. He nodded slowly like he'd expected that answer. All right, but if you change your mind, I won't. He tipped his hat again, climbed back into the saddle, and rode off the way he'd come. The dust rose again, swallowing him, and then it was just the two of them standing in the yard, the paper fluttering slightly in the breeze. Sarah reached for it, her hands shaking. She unfolded it, read the words even though she already knew what they said. The numbers swam, the date stood out like a brand. 30 days. She folded it again, carefully, and slipped it into her apron pocket. Then she turned and walked into the house without a word. Thomas followed. Inside, the cabin was cool and dim, the fire burned down to ash. She stood in the middle of the room, arms wrapped around herself, staring at nothing. Sarah, don't. He stopped a few feet away, waiting. She turned to face him, and the look in her eyes was raw. I can't pay it. I've been scraping together every dollar I can find, and it's not enough. It's never enough. How much do you need? More than I have. How much? She laughed, bitter and sharp. What does it matter? I don't have it. I won't have it in 30 days. And they're going to take it, and there's nothing I can do. There's always something. Stop. Her voice cracked. Stop saying that. Stop pretending like there's some magic answer that I just haven't thought of. I've thought of everything. I've tried everything. And I'm still losing. He took a step toward her, then stopped, like he didn't trust himself to get closer. Let me help. How? She threw her hands up. You going to pull a miracle out of your pocket? You going to walk into town and pay it off yourself? His jaw tightened. He didn't answer. She stared at him, something cold creeping into her chest. Who are you? What? Who are you, Thomas? You show up out of nowhere. You work like you've got something to prove. You disappear into town and come back with money you won't explain. Her voice dropped. Dangerous. And you carry a ledger with my name in it. The silence that followed was suffocating. His face went pale. You went through my things. I found them in the barn, and I saw it. The book, the names, the bank's seal. She stepped closer, her voice shaking with anger and something else, something that felt like betrayal. You work for them, don't you? Sarah, don't lie to me. He looked at her, and for the first time since he'd arrived, she saw fear in his eyes. Not for himself, for what he was about to lose. Yes, he said quietly. The word hit her like a fist. She took a step back, shaking her head. Get out. Sarah, please, get out. Her voice broke, tears burning her eyes. You've been here, eating my food, fixing my fences, pretending to care, and the whole time you work for the people trying to take everything from me. It's not like that. Then what is it like? She was crying now, angry and ashamed. Tell me, make me understand why I should let you stay another second. He opened his mouth, closed it, looked at her with so much pain she almost believed it was real. I can't, he said finally. Then go. He stood there for one more heartbeat, like he was trying to find the words that would fix it. But there were no words, they both knew it. He walked to the corner, gathered his coat, his saddlebag, moved like a man under water, slow and heavy. She watched him, arms crossed, tears streaming down her face, hating him and hating herself for caring. At the door, he paused, looked back. I'm sorry, he said. She didn't answer. And then he was gone. She stood there in the empty cabin, listening to his horse ride away, the sound fading until there was nothing but silence. She sank into the chair by the cold fire, pulled the notice from her pocket, and stared at it until the words blurred together. 30 days. She crumpled the paper in her fist and let herself cry, For her father, for the land, for the man she'd let herself trust, for everything she was about to lose. Outside, the sun climbed higher, indifferent. The valley stretched on, beautiful and quiet, and she was alone again that night. She didn't sleep. She sat on the porch, wrapped in a blanket, watching the stars wheel overhead. The air was cool, the kind of cool that promised autumn wasn't far off. The crickets sang, the wind moved through the grass like water. Somewhere in the distance, a coyote called. She thought about the ledger, about the names and numbers, the careful handwriting, about the way he'd looked at her when she'd asked him to leave, like losing her was the worst thing that had ever happened to him. She thought about the fact that he hadn't denied it, hadn't tried to explain, just said he was sorry and left. Maybe that was all the explanation she needed, or maybe it was the one thing that didn't make sense. She pulled the blanket tighter and watched the horizon, waiting for dawn, waiting for answers that wouldn't come. And in the town, miles away, Thomas stood in front of the bank he'd inherited, the building dark and silent, his reflection staring back at him from the glass doors. He pulled the ledger from his coat and opened it to her name, stared at it for a long time. Then he turned and walked inside, alone. Transition. By dawn, the chair where he'd sat was empty, and his trail led not toward town but toward redemption. The bank smelled like leather and old money. Thomas stood in the hallway, one hand on the mahogany rail, looking up at the portrait of his father that hung above the staircase. The man in the painting stared down with cold eyes, the same eyes Thomas saw in the mirror every morning, the same eyes that had built this place on the backs of people like Sarah. He turned away and walked toward the boardroom. The door was already open. 3 men sat around the table, papers spread before them, cigars burning in crystal ashtrays. They looked up when he entered, and the conversation died. "Gentlemen," Thomas said, closing the door behind him. The eldest of them, a man named Whitmore with silver hair and a face like carved stone, leaned back in his chair. "We didn't expect to see you, Mr. Garrett. Thought you'd given up on this place." "I came back, so we noticed." Whitmore gestured to the empty chair at the head of the table. "Please, sit." Thomas didn't sit. He crossed to the window, looked out at the street below. The town was waking. Shopkeepers sweeping steps, horses being hitched, children running past with their mothers. Life moving forward, oblivious. "I want to talk about the Carver loan," Thomas said. The room went quiet. One of the younger men, Patterson, a lawyer his father had hired years ago, cleared his throat. "The foreclosure's already in motion. Sheriff delivered the notice yesterday. I know, I want it stopped." Whitmore set his cigar down. "Stopped? Yes. On what grounds?" Thomas turned to face them. "On the grounds that it's wrong." Patterson laughed, short and sharp. "Wrong? It's a business transaction. She missed payments. The contract is clear. She's been paying what she can, which isn't enough." Whitmore stood, buttoning his jacket. "Mr. Garrett, with all due respect, you've been absent for months. You don't know the details of this account. I know she's a woman trying to keep her father's land. I know she's worked herself to the bone trying to make it work. And I know that taking it from her won't make this bank stronger. It'll just make us what everyone already thinks we are." "And what's that?" "Vultures." The word hung in the air like smoke. Whitmore's face hardened. "Your father built this institution on sound principles, discipline, accountability. If we forgive every loan that can't be paid, we'll have nothing left." "Then forgive this one," Thomas said quietly. "Just this one." "Why?" Patterson leaned forward, eyes narrowed. "What makes her so special?" Thomas looked at him, and for a moment he considered telling the truth, that he'd stayed in her house, that she'd saved him without knowing who he was, that every fence he'd mended and every board he'd nailed had been an apology for what his name had taken from her. But the truth wouldn't help her. It would only make things worse. "Because it's the right thing to do," he said instead. Whitmore shook his head. "That's not how banks work." "Then maybe it should be. You can't run a business on sentiment. And you can't build a town by destroying the people who live in it." Whitmore studied him for a long moment, then glanced at the other men. Something unspoken passed between them. When he looked back at Thomas, his expression was cold. "Your father would be ashamed of you." Thomas flinched, but didn't look away. "My father's dead. This is my decision now, not entirely." Whitmore picked up a stack of papers, tapped them into alignment. "You may own the majority share, Mr. Garrett, but you're not the only shareholder, and the board has a say in how this institution is run." Then vote on it. We already have. Thomas went still. What? Last month, when you disappeared without notice, we held an emergency session. The board voted to remove you from operational decisions unless you could prove you were fit to lead. Whitmore slid a document across the table. You've been absent, erratic, and now you're asking us to forgive debts based on personal feelings. That's not leadership. That's liability. Thomas looked down at the paper. His name. The votes. All of it legal. All of it binding. You can't do this, he said, his voice low. We already did. Patterson stood, collecting his papers. You're welcome to retain your shares, Mr. Garrett, but the bank will be managed by men who understand what your father built, men who won't let sentiment destroy it. Thomas's hands curled into fists. If you take her land, it's already done, Whitmore said. The clock is ticking. 30 days and the property reverts to us. That's the law. The law isn't always right, perhaps, but it's what we have. Whitmore picked up his hat, adjusted it. Good day, Mr. Garrett. If you'll excuse us, we have work to do. They filed out, one by one, leaving him alone in the room with the portrait of his father staring down from the wall. He stood there for a long time, the weight of it pressing down on him like a stone. Then he walked to the desk, pulled out a pen and paper, and began to write. It took him 2 days to arrange it. 2 days of meetings with lawyers, of digging through contracts and ownership papers, of finding every loophole and leverage point his father had taught him to exploit. 2 days of barely sleeping, of pacing his room in the hotel above the bank, of staring at the ledger with Sarah's name circled in ink. By the end of it, he had a plan. It wasn't clean, it wasn't easy, but it would work. He signed the final document just after midnight, his hands steady despite the exhaustion pulling at him. The lawyer across the desk looked at him with something between respect and pity. You understand what you're doing? The man asked. Yes, you'll lose your position. Your father's legacy is already lost. Thomas capped the pen, slid the paper across. Make sure it's filed by morning. The lawyer nodded, tucked the document into his case, and left. Thomas sat alone in the dim office, listening to the clock tick on the wall. Outside, the town was dark and still. Inside, he felt something break loose in his chest, something he'd been holding on to for too long. He walked to the window, pressed his palm against the glass, and looked out at the valley beyond the town. Somewhere out there, Sarah was lying awake, counting the days she had left. He closed his eyes. I'm sorry, he whispered to the darkness, but I'm going to fix this. Even if you never forgive me. 3 days later, the notices went out. Not just to Sarah, but to every small farmer who owed the bank money. Every widow, every struggling family, every person his father had lent to with conditions too harsh to meet. The notices were simple. Debt forgiven. Ownership transferred. No further payment required. The town erupted. Some celebrated. Some wept. Some stood in the street holding the papers like they couldn't believe what they were reading. The board tried to stop it, but the paperwork was ironclad. Thomas had signed over his controlling shares to a trust designed to forgive the loans and protect the land from foreclosure. By the time Whitmore and the others realized what he'd done, it was too late to reverse it. He'd given up everything. His inheritance, his name, his place at the head of the table. He did it without telling her. Because if she knew, she'd refuse. She'd try to give it back or pay him somehow, and that would defeat the entire point. This wasn't about gratitude. It wasn't about redemption. It was about doing the one thing his father never did, choosing mercy over profit. The morning after the notices arrived, Thomas packed his things in the hotel room. A single bag, a coat, the ledger, which he burned in the fireplace until it was nothing but ash. He left town before dawn, riding west, away from Dry Creek, away from the valley, away from the woman whose face he knew he'd see every time he closed his eyes. He didn't leave a note, didn't say goodbye. He just rode, the sun rising at his back, the weight finally lifting from his shoulders. And on the farm, Sarah stood on her porch, holding the notice in her hands, reading it over and over, tears streaming down her face. Debt forgiven. She looked out at the valley, at the land that was hers again, and felt something break and heal at the same time. She didn't know who had done it. The paperwork was anonymous, processed through a lawyer she'd never heard of. But deep down, in the part of her that had watched him mend fences and split wood and carry guilt in his eyes, she knew. She sank down onto the steps, the paper clutched to her chest, and cried until she couldn't anymore. And when the tears finally stopped, she stood, walked to the barn, and found the corner where he'd slept. His blanket was folded neatly. His cup was washed and set on the shelf, and tucked beneath the blanket was a single piece of paper, folded small. She opened it with shaking hands. "I'm sorry I couldn't tell you the truth. I'm sorry for what my name took from you. I hope this makes it right. T." She read it 3 times. Then she folded it carefully, slipped it into her pocket, and walked outside. The sun was warm, the valley stretched wide and green, and for the first time in years it felt like hers. Transition. The world turned quieter, but the silence carried his promise, one that would return with the spring thaw. Winter came slow that year. The first frost touched the valley in late October, turning the grass silver in the mornings, the air sharp enough to sting. Sarah worked through it, bundling hay, reinforcing the barn, preparing for the cold months ahead. The land was hers now, truly hers. But the work didn't change. If anything, it felt heavier, like she was carrying not just her own survival but his sacrifice too. She tried not to think about him. Failed every time. His note was folded in the drawer beside her bed, the edges soft from being read too many times. She told herself it was closure, told herself she'd moved on. But at night, when the fire burned low and the cabin creaked in the wind, she'd pull it out and read it again, tracing the letters with her finger like they were a map to something she'd lost. Town was different now. When she rode in for supplies, people looked at her differently. Some nodded with respect. Others whispered behind their hands. The story had spread, how the bank had forgiven her loan, how others had been forgiven too, how someone had dismantled the system that had kept half the valley in chains. But no one knew who. The bank itself had gone quiet. The doors stayed open, but the men who used to run it were gone. Whitmore had left town. Patterson had taken a position in the city, and the building sat like a shell waiting for something or someone to give it life again. Sarah didn't go near it, didn't want to. The place still carried ghosts. But then, one morning in early November, the rumors started. She heard them at the general store, whispered between 2 women picking through fabric. "New owner, they say. Came in last night. No one knows his name." Sarah's hands stilled on the bag of flour she was holding. The shopkeeper, a wiry man named Morton, leaned over the counter. "You hear about the bank, Miss Carver?" She set the flour down. "What about it?" "Got a new owner. Young fellow. Rode in after dark. Went straight to the building, and hasn't come out since." He lowered his voice, eyes gleaming with a thrill of gossip. "Some folks think it's one of Whitmore's people, coming back to undo what was done. Others say it's someone else entirely." Sarah's chest tightened. "You seen him?" "Not yet. But the whole town's talking. There's a meeting this afternoon, public announcement or some such. Everyone's going." She nodded slowly, paid for her supplies, and left. Outside, the street was busier than usual. People gathered in clusters, voices low and urgent. The air hummed with tension, the kind that came before a storm or a fight. She loaded her horse, tied the bags down, and told herself to ride home, but her feet wouldn't move. She stood there, staring down the street toward the bank, her heart pounding for reasons she didn't want to name. And then she started walking. The crowd had already gathered by the time she arrived. They stood in front of the bank. Maybe 50 people, maybe more. Farmers and shopkeepers, widows and families, all waiting. The doors were still closed, the windows dark. A new sign hung above the entrance, freshly painted, but draped with cloth so the words were hidden. Sarah stayed at the edge of the crowd, arms crossed, trying to blend in. Beside her, an older man with a weathered face nodded toward the building. "Think he'll show?" "Who?" Sarah asked. "Whoever bought it. Folks are saying he's got plans, big ones." "What kind of plans?" The man shrugged. "Guess we'll find out." The doors opened. The crowd went silent. A figure stepped out onto the wooden platform in front of the bank. A man, tall and lean, dressed in a clean coat and dark trousers. His face was shadowed by the brim of his hat, but even from a distance, Sarah felt something in her chest lurch. No, it couldn't be. He walked to the edge of the platform, removed his hat, and looked out at the crowd. Thomas. The world tilted. Sarah's breath caught, her hands gripping her arms so tight it hurt. Around her, the crowd murmured, confused, curious. But she couldn't hear them. Couldn't hear anything except the roar of blood in her ears. He looked different, cleaner, steadier. But it was him. The same eyes, the same quiet intensity that had always made her feel like he saw too much. And now he was standing in front of the bank that had nearly destroyed her, looking like he owned it. Because he did. "My name is Thomas Garrett," he said, his voice carrying clear and strong over the crowd. "Some of you know that name. Some of you knew my father." The murmurs grew louder. Sarah saw recognition ripple through the people around her, shock, anger, disbelief. "My father built this bank," Thomas continued, his gaze sweeping the crowd. "He built it on loans and contracts, on interest and deadlines. He believed in discipline, in holding people to their word." He paused. "But he also believed that the land and the people on it were resources to be managed, not lives to be respected." Someone in the crowd shouted, "So why are you here?" Thomas looked toward the voice, steady. "Because I'm not my father." The crowd shifted, uncertain. "I know what this bank has done. I know the families it's broken, the land it's taken, the debts it's held over people who had no choice but to borrow." His voice hardened. "And I know that some of you are standing here today because a few weeks ago, those debts were forgiven." Silence. Sarah felt tears prick her eyes. She blinked them back hard. "That wasn't an accident," Thomas said. "That wasn't charity. That was an attempt to undo some of the harm this place has caused. But forgiveness isn't enough. The system that created those debts is still here, and unless we change it, it'll just happen again." He reached up and pulled the cloth from the sign above the doors. The new words gleamed in the late morning light: Dry Creek Community Trust. "This isn't a bank anymore," Thomas said. "It's a trust. A place where people can borrow what they need to survive, to build, to grow, without the threat of losing everything if they stumble. Interest stays low, terms stay fair, and no one will be foreclosed on for missing a payment during hard times." The crowd erupted, some in cheers, some in questions, some in outright disbelief. A man near the front shouted, "How do we know you're not just saying this? How do we know you won't turn into your father?" Thomas didn't flinch. "You don't. But I'm giving you my word, and I'm putting it in writing. Every loan, every term, every decision will be reviewed by a board made up of people from this town. People who've lived through what this bank has done. People who know what fair looks like." Another voice, a woman's. "And what do you get out of it?" Thomas looked at her, then out at the rest of the crowd. "A chance to prove that my name doesn't have to mean what it used to." The murmurs softened, shifting from anger to something more cautious. Hope, maybe, or at least the possibility of it. Sarah couldn't move, couldn't breathe. She just stood there staring at him, her mind racing. He'd come back, not for her, not to apologize, but to finish what he'd started. And then his eyes found hers in the crowd. The world stopped. For a moment they just looked at each other, across the distance, across everything that had been broken and left unsaid. His expression didn't change, but something in his gaze softened, something that looked like regret, or longing, or both. She turned and walked away before he could see her cry. She made it halfway to her horse before she heard footsteps behind her. "Sarah!" She stopped, her back to him, her hands shaking. "Please," he said quietly, "just let me explain." She turned, and the anger she'd been holding on to for weeks finally broke free. "Explain what? That you lied to me? That you let me believe you were just some drifter when you were the reason I almost lost everything? I didn't know. You knew exactly who I was, Thomas. You had my name in that ledger. You knew what your bank was doing to me, and you stayed in my house and let me thank you for fixing my fences while you carried the weight of it in your pocket." His jaw tightened. "You're right. I know I'm right. I should have told you. Yes, you should have." Her voice cracked. "But you didn't. You just left. And now you're back, standing up there like some kind of hero, and I'm supposed to, what? Forget? Forgive? I'm not asking you to forgive me." "Then what are you asking?" He looked at her, and the rawness in his eyes nearly undid her. "I'm asking you to let me try to make it right. Not with you. I know I can't fix that. But with this place, with the people my father hurt, that doesn't change what you did. I know. It doesn't change that you lied. I know." She stared at him, tears streaming down her face now, and hated that she still felt something when she looked at him. Hated that part of her wanted to believe him. "Why did you come back?" she asked, her voice barely a whisper. "Because staying away felt like giving up." He took a step closer, close enough that she could see the exhaustion carved into his face. And because if I have to spend the rest of my life trying to be better than my father, I'd rather do it here, where it matters. She shook her head, wiping her eyes. You can't fix everything, Thomas. I know, but I can try. The street was quieter now. The crowd had started to disperse, people drifting back to their lives, their work. The sun climbed higher, pale and distant. Sarah looked at him one last time, at the man who'd saved her and broken her in the same breath, and took a step back. I hope it works, she said. I hope you build something good here, but I can't be part of it. Not now. I understand. She turned and walked away, and this time, he didn't follow. The weeks that followed were strange. The town adjusted slowly to the new reality. The trust opened its doors and people came, hesitant at first, then hopeful. Thomas worked from dawn to dusk, meeting with families, reviewing contracts, dismantling the systems his father had built. He didn't come to the farm. Sarah told herself she was glad, told herself she didn't look for him every time she rode into town, told herself the ache in her chest would fade. It didn't. But the land thrived. The crops came in strong, the fences held, and for the first time in years, she could breathe without the weight of debt pressing down on her. She owed him that, even if she couldn't say it to his face. Transition. As the crowd dispersed, he looked once more toward the edge of town, where a woman waited by a horse, and forgiveness waited with her. Spring came quietly. It started with the thaw, slow and steady, water trickling down from the hills, pooling in the low ground, turning the frozen earth soft again. Then the first green shoots pushed through, tentative and brave, and the valley began to wake. Sarah stood on her porch in the pale morning light, a cup of coffee warming her hands, watching the world come back to life. The air smelled like wet soil and new growth. The birds had returned, filling the silence with song. Everything felt lighter somehow, easier. She'd survived the winter. The farm had too. The barn was solid now, the roof patched and holding. The fences stood straight. The house no longer groaned when the wind blew. She'd done it, kept it going, kept it alive, against every odd that had been stacked against her. But it didn't feel like victory. It felt like waiting. She told herself it was just the season. Spring always made her restless, full of anticipation for the planting ahead, the long days of work that stretched into summer. But deep down, she knew it was more than that. She was waiting for something she couldn't name, or wouldn't. Town had changed. The trust was thriving. Slowly, carefully, but thriving. People spoke of Thomas with a cautious respect now, the kind earned through action rather than inheritance. He'd kept his word. Loans were fair. Terms were clear. And when families stumbled, the trust didn't punish them. It helped them stand back up. Sarah heard the stories secondhand, whispered over counters and shared at Sunday gatherings. She didn't go to the trust, didn't see him, but his presence was everywhere, woven into the fabric of the town like thread through cloth. She told herself it didn't matter, told herself she'd moved on. But every time she rode past the building, her eyes flicked toward the windows, searching. It was mid-April when she saw him again. She'd come to town for seed, early enough that the streets were still quiet, the shopkeepers just opening their doors. She tied her horse outside the general store, and was reaching for the door when she heard it. Raised voices, angry. She turned and saw a small crowd gathered down the street near the trust. Two men stood on the steps, one of them shouting, the other trying to calm him. And between them, Thomas, his coat dusty, his face calm but firm. Sarah's stomach tightened. She should have walked away, should have gone into the store, bought her seed, and left. But her feet carried her forward, closer, until she could hear the words. Can't keep doing this. The shouting man, a rancher named Cole, she recognized him now, jabbed a finger toward Thomas. You keep bending the rules for people who can't pay and the whole thing falls apart. The rules aren't bending, Thomas said evenly. They're working the way they were designed to. Designed to fail, you mean? Cole's face was red, veins standing out on his neck. Your father knew how to run a bank. You're just giving money away. My father took more than he gave. That's not something I'm interested in continuing. Then you're a fool. Cole spat into the dirt, and when this place goes under, don't come crying to the rest of us. He shoved past Thomas and stormed off, the crowd parting to let him through. The other man on the steps, older, grayer, put a hand on Thomas's shoulder, said something low that Sarah couldn't hear, then followed Cole down the street. Thomas stood there alone, watching them go, his jaw tight. Then his eyes found Sarah in the crowd. Her breath caught. For a moment, neither of them moved. The world narrowed to just the two of them, the space between them filled with months of silence and everything unsaid. Then someone bumped into her, muttering an apology, and the spell broke. She turned and walked away, her heart pounding so hard it hurt. Behind her, she heard him call her name. She didn't stop. She made it to the edge of town before he caught up. "Sarah, wait. Don't." She didn't turn around. "Just don't. I need to talk to you. We've said everything we need to say." "No, we haven't." She stopped, her hands clenched into fists at her sides. "What do you want, Thomas?" He came around to face her, breathless, his hair disheveled from running. "I want to apologize. You already did. Not properly." He took a breath, steadying himself. "I lied to you. I hid who I was because I was ashamed of it, and in doing that, I made you feel like you couldn't trust me. And you were right not to." She looked at him, at the exhaustion in his eyes, the weight he carried. "You think an apology fixes that? No, but it's a start." "A start to what?" "To being honest." He took a step closer, close enough that she could see the faint scar on his temple where he'd hit his head that first night. "I came back because I couldn't stay away. Not from the work, not from this place, and not from you." Her heart stuttered. "Thomas, I know you don't owe me anything. I know I don't deserve forgiveness. But I need you to know that everything I've done since I left, every decision, every change, I did it because of you, because you showed me what it looks like to fight for something that matters. And I wanted to be someone worthy of that." Tears burned her eyes. "You can't just come back and say things like that." "Why not?" "Because it's not fair." Her voice broke. "You broke my trust, Thomas. You made me care about you, and then you left, and I had to pick up the pieces by myself. And now you're standing here asking me to, what, forget? Pretend it didn't hurt? No." His voice was soft, urgent. "I'm asking you to let me prove that I'm not the man who left, that I'm trying to be better." She shook her head, tears spilling over. "I don't know if I can do that. Then just let me try." He reached out, hesitated, then let his hand fall. "I'm not asking for forgiveness, Sarah. I'm just asking for a chance." She looked at him through blurred vision, her chest aching with everything she'd been holding back. Part of her wanted to say yes, wanted to believe him, wanted to let herself feel what she'd been fighting for months. But the other part, the part that had learned to survive by not trusting anyone, held her back. "I need time," she said finally. He nodded slowly. "I understand. I'm not saying yes. I'm not saying no. I'm just saying I need time. Take all the time you need." He stepped back, giving her space. "I'll be here." She wiped her eyes, nodded, and walked past him to her horse. She didn't look back, but as she rode out of town, something inside her felt lighter. Not healed, not whole, but lighter. The weeks passed. She planted the spring crops, potatoes, beans, squash. The work filled her days, left her exhausted at night, and that was good. It kept her from thinking too much, kept her from wondering. But on Sundays, when the work slowed and the valley settled into quiet, she'd find herself standing on the porch looking toward town, wondering if he was still there, wondering if he meant what he said. It was late May when he came to the farm. She was in the garden, hands deep in soil, when she heard the hoofbeats. She looked up, shading her eyes, and saw him riding up the path, slow, careful, like he wasn't sure he'd be welcome. She stood, wiping her hands on her apron, and waited. He dismounted at the gate, tied his horse, and walked toward her. He looked thinner than she remembered. Tired, but his eyes were clear. "Hi," he said. "Hi." They stood there for a moment, the silence awkward and familiar at the same time. "I brought something," he said, reaching into his saddlebag. He pulled out a small wooden box, plain and unadorned, and held it out to her. She took it, her hands trembling slightly. "What is it?" "Open it." She did. Inside, nestled in cloth, was a deed, her name, her land, signed and sealed with no liens, no debts, no conditions. She looked up at him, confused. "I thought it was already forgiven." "I know, but I wanted you to have proof, something you could hold, something that said this land is yours, free and clear, and no one, not me, not the bank, not anyone, can take it from you." Her throat tightened. "Why?" "Because you deserve to know it's real." He looked at her, and there was no performance in it, no charm. Just honesty. "And because I wanted you to know that I'm not asking for anything in return. This isn't a transaction. It's just the truth." She stared down at the deed. at her name written in careful script, and felt something break open inside her. "Thomas, I know you need time," he said quickly. "I'm not here to pressure you. I just wanted you to have that, and to tell you that whatever you decide, I'll respect it." She set the box down carefully on the porch rail and looked at him. Really looked, past the guilt and the history and the fear. And she saw him. Not the man who'd lied, not the heir to a legacy of greed, just Thomas, tired and trying and terrifyingly sincere. "Stay for coffee," she said. He blinked, surprised. "What? Stay for coffee? I just made a pot." A slow smile spread across his face, tentative and hopeful. "Yeah, I'd like that." They walked to the porch together, and she poured 2 cups. They sat on the steps, side by side, looking out at the valley as the sun climbed higher. For a long time, neither of them spoke. Then Sarah said, "I'm still angry, I know, and I'm still scared, I know, but I'm tired of carrying it alone." He looked at her, and his eyes were soft. "You don't have to." She leaned her shoulder against his, just slightly, and felt him lean back. "One day at a time," she said. "One day at a time," he agreed. They sat there as the morning stretched into afternoon. The light warm and golden, the valley alive with the sound of wind and water and growing things. And for the first time in longer than either of them could remember, the future felt like something they could build together. Summer came, slow and full. Thomas didn't move to the farm, but he visited often, fixing what needed fixing, sharing meals, talking late into the evening. They learned each other again, this time without lies, without the weight of secrets pressing down. It wasn't perfect. There were days when the past rose up like a shadow, when Sarah pulled back and Thomas gave her space, days when words were hard and trust felt fragile. But they kept showing up, kept trying, and slowly, carefully, something new grew between them. Something stronger than what had been broken. By autumn, when the leaves turned gold and the air grew crisp, Thomas brought his things to the farm, not all at once, not with grand gestures, just a bag, a coat, a quiet understanding that he was staying. Sarah watched him stack firewood for the winter, and felt something settle in her chest, something like peace. One evening, as they sat on the porch watching the sun dip below the hills, he reached over and took her hand. She didn't pull away. "Thank you," he said quietly. "For what?" "For giving me a chance to be better." She squeezed his hand, her eyes on the horizon. "Thank you for taking it." The sun set, painting the valley in shades of orange and pink. The land stretched out before them, hers, theirs, alive with possibility. And as darkness settled soft over Dry Creek, Sarah leaned her head against his shoulder and let herself believe, not in perfection, not in easy answers, but in the kind of redemption that came slow and hard-won, built one fence post, one honest word, one quiet evening at a time. The valley breathed around them, ancient and patient, and they breathed with it. Final image. And as the sun dipped behind the hills, Dry Creek felt like home again. Not just for them, but for everyone who believed a man could change.